once again, an ADG Pro video didn't quite go as intended. The goal for today was to take a look back at the updated version of Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego, and see if we could find any sort of patterns or details in regards to his travel mechanics. As something I noticed back when I first played this game is that traveling around seemed to have some curious patterns to it, and I wondered if perhaps analyzing those patterns would help reveal some of the inner workings of the game's mechanics. Alas, I ultimately discovered the travel mechanics were indeed entirely random, though I did learn a few interesting tidbits about how it's doing its randomization, so we'll go over those for sure. But once I realized there wasn't really a way to correlate the travel mechanics to how the game was playing out, I decided to dive deeper into the rest of the game's mechanics to see what other useful pieces of information I could dredge up. And I did indeed discover quite a number of things, and nothing that really helps manipulate the outcome or take shortcuts towards arresting the crooks, but things which definitely help in making sense of the clues you get, as well as shortcuts you can take in terms of getting your arrest warrants issued. Also, before we get into all of these details, I should point out again that I'm playing the revised release of the game from 1990, not the original 1985 release. This is pertinent because, even though the raw gameplay is much the same, there's two considerable differences. The first is that, in the original game, capturing Carmen Sandiego herself was never really a guarantee, it was just part of the randomization. In fact, you could go the entire game and never capture her. Whereas here in the revised version, you always capture Carmen Sandiego on your very last case before your game is concluded and you're subsequently removed from the detective roster. The other important point is that the original game had a cheat mode, which could be enabled from the command prompt, which was not included with the revised 1990 release. Plus, I wasn't able to find any trainers for the game, thus I kinda had to make do with the time limits presented, which kinda limited my options for investigating the mechanics as thoroughly as I would have liked. Anyways, let's get into the finer details, starting with the difficulty. The game makes note that it gets more difficult the further into it you get, but I wondered how this effect was being achieved. Well, it turns out the hints you get during a case do not change in any way whatsoever as you get deeper and deeper into a career. Instead, all that changes is how many stops you need to make at a minimum to find the crook that you need to arrest. You start the game with a rank of Rookie, which equates to visiting 5 cities in total to capture the bad guy. Then quickly move up to the rank of Sleuth, which requires visiting 6 cities, move on to Private Eye, where you visit 7 cities, Investigator, where you visit 8 cities, and finally Ace Detective, where you visit 9 cities. The trick is that because of how much time passes when you hunt for clues or make mistakes, higher ranks mean you have fewer chances to screw up, and once you get up to Investigator, you pretty much can't go for every hint at every location and make the arrest on time unless you get really lucky in terms of how close each location is to each other, since the distances between locations affects how much time you spend traveling. Now, looking at the travel mechanics in particular, I discovered some interesting quirks about how they work. There's 30 locations in total you can visit, and every time you boot the game, these locations are procedurally woven into a strange matrix of sorts. This matrix is produced in such a way that each location can link to either 2, 3, or 4 other locations. Each location must backlink to the locations linked to it, but also, without backtracking, it must take a minimum of 6 trips to leave a location and return to it. Now, if we put a map of all 30 cities in the game on screen and try to demonstrate how one of these matrices might look, it, well, kinda looks like a giant mess. But the fact that there's some logic going into how this matrix of flight paths is being generated means that it's virtually impossible to take a wrong flight and yet end up somewhere you're supposed to go later in the case. I actually checked the procedural process out more than once and noticed that the total number of paths and the number of cities which have 2, 3, or 4 links all varies with each generation of the map. So for the most part, this is all entirely RNG and thus impossible to predict or glean any useful info out of for solving cases, especially since, again, this matrix of flight paths is only generated at boot. Once you've boot the game up, the map will be generated and then will not change until you either close the program or load a saved game. What's curious about this too is that save game files are very small and have a large portion of their data dedicated to plain text of the treasure that you're trying to recover, meaning there's not enough space in them to store this map matrix. This means that the save files must be storing the randomization seeds used to generate all of this. And I find that very interesting and also not too unexpected. Since random number generation is not really random on early computing devices, you can effectively take advantage of your algorithms and force identical pseudo-random outcomes just by recording how you seeded your random number generator. Next, let's talk about how the hint system works. Every city you can visit will have 3 types of locations set up which you can get clues from, which instead serve as places to search for the crook in the final stop on your trip. These venues are also randomly selected with every case, but one of the curious things I noticed is that the hints you get are not actually based on what these venues are. Rather, instead, it's based on which slot the venue is in. To put it simply, if we call this location on the left slot 1, the one in the middle slot 2, and the one on the right slot 3, then the way the hints are generated is that slot 1 will always be a reference hint of some sort, referring to the currency in use, a commonly traded or produced commodity, the proper name of a noteworthy person from the destination country, that sort of thing. Slot 2 will always be a geopolitical hint, such as what the flag looks like or a rough approximation of where the destination is relative to something else. Slot 3 is the wildcard hint, and can be either a slot 1 type of hint or a slot 2 type of hint. Now, the kind of venue you're getting your hint from plays no factor in any of this, only whether it's the first, second, or third slot. Now, one thing that can get very confusing with the hints is that almost every single hint in the game is in reference to the country of the destination city, not the city itself. In fact, this is why all the larger countries seem to only have one city you can visit. It's because the hints are decoupled from the city and refer to the country that city is in as a whole. For example, the flag for the city of Paris is blue and red with a coat of arms in the middle. Yet if you get a hint saying that the flag is red and blue, your actual destination will be the city of Reykjavik in Iceland, which, yes, I'm aware the flag for Iceland is blue with a red cross inside a larger white cross, but this game is actually kind of bad with its flag descriptions. Now, Paris is in France, so naturally you would think the flag for that destination would be reported as blue, white, and red, but it's actually reported as red, white, and blue. Yeah, most of the flag identifiers in this game do not respect order of colors. That said, though, I do kinda understand what they're going for here, because they wanted to add ambiguity to some of the hints, as oftentimes the hints may refer to multiple destinations you have access to, and thus you'll need to get more hints to figure out for sure where you're going. For instance, if you get a hint saying that the crook was going golfing with the president, and one of your destinations you can fly to is New York in the USA, that almost seems like it would be spot on, except there's a surprisingly large number of countries whose ruling leader is referred to as a president. Thus, if you go for another hint and it says that they were looking into black market australs, then congratulations, you're actually headed for Buenos Aires. In fact, that was one of the big things I was noticing when I started really dialing down the nature of the hints, is that every hint in the game is categorized in a particular way to determine how it's presented as a speaking point. The common categories for this include the appearance of the flag, the type of currency in use, the name of the ruling leader or leaders, what primary languages are spoken, commonly traded or produced commodities, common kinds of animals, noteworthy landmarks, places, people, or heck, one of the common categories happens to be which nation colonized the place once upon a time. As you learn what these hint categories are, you can begin to fill in the blanks the more you play the game, and compile quite the table of values. And before you know it, having the World Almanac which came with this game almost becomes pointless, as you'll be referring to your lookup table instead of that almanac or other online sources nowadays. By the time I reached the rank of Ace Detective, I had compiled such a strong table of hint lookups that I was able to reach most destinations successfully after just 1 or 2 hints, and only on rare occasions needed 3 hints or to look up the answer online, since I don't have the almanac. But this resulted in most of my final cases lasting less than 10 minutes each real time. Plus, there's another really important thing to keep in mind. You always get only 1 hint per location. If you seem to get 2 hints, the second hint is always in reference to the crook and not the destination. This is pertinent because some of the crook hints really can sound like they're in reference to the destination, such as when the crook hint is in reference to Great Mountains. And if that's part of the second hint, then that's not a reference to the destination. It's telling you that the crook's hobby is mountain climbing. In fact, let's talk about the crooks for a second, because there's something eminently important about this. Not all of the traits you can input into the crime computer are actually used in the game. In fact, 6 of the 21 traits you can input into the crime computer are never used, and having just one of those 6 traits selected immediately eliminates all suspects. Those traits are the hobbies of music, skydiving, and swimming, the features of limps or scar, or the vehicle selection of a race car. The skydiving one is pertinent because one of the hints you can get indicates someone either brags about or hates, quote, dangerous sports. Now, since mountain climbing and skydiving are both options for hobbies, you'd think dangerous sports could be in reference to either. But again, none of the crooks have a hobby of skydiving, thus anyone who brags about dangerous sports is actually into mountain climbing. But then, what if it says they hate dangerous sports? Wouldn't that reference the rest of the hobbies? Well, all of the other hobbies which are actually referenced in the dossiers are tennis, mountain climbing, and croquet. And while I wouldn't classify tennis as dangerous, it's certainly way more strenuous than the croquet, and that's the logic the game uses too, as the clue of hates dangerous sports means the crook plays croquet. Other things which can get confusing with the hints related to the crooks is that there's a differentiation between wearing a ring and wearing jewelry, even though a ring is itself technically jewelry. So yeah, if they say ring, they mean ring. If they say jewelry, they mean jewelry. Treat them like 2 totally separate things. Also, even though you can't put food references into the crime computer, do note that if someone gives you a hint that someone loves or hates a particular kind of food, love means that's the kind of food they're referenced to enjoy, while hate means the kind of food they're referenced to enjoy is something else, not that the dossier explicitly indicates a dislike of that food. One last thing to mention too, even though it's very minor but still potentially significant if you're running short on time, is that when you finally catch up to the crook and reach the city they're in, the first venue you visit from the 3 that you can choose from will never have the crook present. And then whatever venue you choose next will be a 50-50 shot of catching the crook, which always happens the instant you go there and without costing you any time. Thus, if you're in the final city but short on time, if you run out on the first pick, you are never going to win. And if you run out on the second pick, you failed a coin flip, which kind of sucks, but what are you going to do? Anywho, that's about all I've got to say about where in the world is Carmen Sandiego this time around. Now that I better understand what's going on under the hood, I find the game considerably easier than I did before, especially since it allowed me to categorize the hints I was getting and then use that information to guide my course through the game, rather than relying on looking up details online. Now, I will say that my method of playing here definitely misses the point as to what this game was supposed to be about. But it kind of hits a different point instead, being able to categorize and organize information in a useful way, and that in and of itself can be an interesting way of playing the game. This is also why I decided not to show the tables of information I compiled over the course of making this video. I mean, firstly, they're not complete. The game has a ton of little facts buried within it, so it'd take a very long time to make a complete table of every single possible hint. But secondly, I feel that playing the game without access to reference materials whatsoever is actually a viable way to play, and could in and of itself breathe new life into the game for those who haven't played it since childhood. Now, you're not going to succeed on your first few cases for darn sure playing the game like that, but if you persevere with this strategy, I guarantee you will catch Carmen Sandiego by the time you're done. Although you'll still need access to the copy protection answers, since every time you rank up it asks you one of them, so at least keep those answers handy. But for now, that'll be all for today's ADG Pro video. Next up, 2 Saturdays from now, on November 16th, will be a standard review, episode 335, where we'll be taking a look at a game featuring characters who've already shown up in a previous ADG video. Although, other than having the same characters, this game doesn't play anything like the one we've already covered, so make sure to stay tuned to see which game this could possibly be. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to everyone supporting me on Patreon. If you'd like to join the ranks of everyone you see here supporting the show directly, head on over to patreon.com/KASICK.